Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Journey Through Reality podcast. This is my first guest episode, and who better than Alex, also known as Left Brain Mystic on Substack. Um, Alex and I connected quite early on Substack, and he's really supported my journey throughout the time that I've been doing it. And I'm really grateful that he has graciously agreed to come on the show and talk about panpsychism with us. So, Alex, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be invited. Yeah, I like you said, we connected quite early on Substack, and since then I enjoyed reading your stuff. And it seems like we have quite an overlap on ideas and interests. So I'm
I
really
think
looking forward.
so. I think so. I mean, one of the reasons that I wanted to speak to you about consciousness and panpsychism is since sort of leaving Christianity, this has been slightly a bit of an obsession of mine, other than the question of God and all that kind of stuff, theism and philosophy of religion. The philosophy of mind has really been on my mind, as they say, no pun intended. So I think your work has really helped me sort of think about sort of consciousness and panpsychism, that kind of stuff, and really helped me figure out where I am on it. But before we get to that, do you want to just introduce yourself a little bit and just what you do and all that kind of stuff?
Sure thing. So yeah, like you said, Left Brain Mystic, that's my handle on Substack, and it kind of describes what I'm going for. I myself started as a Christian as a child, but early on didn't really feel to like I fit into religion because it was so dogmatic. Arguably, my first contact of it was through my grandma and so on, and they just have a very fundamentalist view on religion, so this skewed my opinion on it quite severely. But then again, through education and so on, through my academic journey, let's say it like that, I found sufficient evidence and information that gave me the idea of saying, hey, everything is explainable through scientific, materialistic understandings, just looking at things through this evidence based, analytical perspective, let's say it like this. And this was like kind of my personality. I was like not just atheist, but kind of anti theist for quite some time until I realized like the bottom of science, that it isn't a complete thing, that we still have so many open questions, and those are still intriguing and kind of lead to something that isn't really explainable through pure materialistic explanations. For example, like the philosophy of mind, right? For example, looking at consciousness and saying, hey, is this really explainable just mechanistically? And this is where my mystical side kind of awakened, and I was exploring so many new things that similarly made sense. And this is the beginning of my journey. It's like saying, hey, I started with the left brain analytical understanding of the world, but now I see the value of mysticism and spiritual ideas, not just as like woo woo things that are opposed to science, but how to integrate them actually.
Yeah, I love that, man. I think we've kind of gone on similar journeys to an extent. There's a few parallels, and I mean the Christianity I was brought up with. I guess I was quite lucky in the sense that I was brought up in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and for all its flaws, one of the things I always appreciated was the emphasis on mysticism. At least in theory, we didn't have loads of mystics, walking about the average parish or whatever, but I always appreciated it, and I wanted the first thing I wanted to ask you about was how do we sort of try and bridge that gap between rationalism and mysticism, because very often they're seen as polar opposites, things that you know um, can't be integrated, things that like they're just completely two epistemological systems, two different ways of seeing the world. So obviously you alluded to the fact that like a big part of your project has been to try and figure out how to kind of do both and be both. So how do we do that?
Yeah, one approach is simply asking questions. I think it's like there is necessary and valued in the rigid structures of science. Let's say it like this, because we have to be skeptic. We have to kind of expect from our understanding of reality to be verifiable in some sense. Otherwise, it's like purely subjective, purely like essentially solipsistic, because whatever you claim to be real is like your version of reality, which isn't compatible with the overarching understanding. So we have to use this fundamental skepticism and scientific approach of understanding reality through observation and exploration in a repeatable and rigid sense. But the thing that materialistic science or the paradigm currently is missing is asking or allowing all kinds of questions. This is essentially everything that is wrong with the current paradigm. We kind of created this chasm, this gap between what kind of questions are allowed and what aren't. We see this with Sheldrake, for example. He uses scientific methods, but asks questions that aren't allowed currently, and thus aren't accepted by the scientific what's it called, the scientific enterprise. It's simply asking, hey, might there be something like a field of mind rather than like simply mechanistic processes? And if you ask a question that allows for mysticism as answer, you can test it through scientific methods. This is, yeah, the approach can also be summarized to not um, go on too long. We started with a quantitative approach. We asked questions that were essentially translatable to math. But now we have this quantitative structure of theories of physics like general relativity and so on. But we that we have the scaffolding, this framework, we can start integrating qualitative questions again and essentially color in the structure we created before. And this is where mysticism fits in. If you start with mysticism without a scaffolding, without a structure, you don't know where the borders are to color in the image of reality, so to speak. But now that we have the structure, we can essentially complete the picture and try to bring back qualia, bring back so experience the qualitative aspects of reality.
Yeah, that's awesome, and I think it really reminds me of the way Philip Goff talks about consciousness and all that kind of stuff. You know, obviously, famously, he has a book called Galileo's Error, where he outlines this split between the qualitative and the qualitative,
Mm-hmm.
and he thinks that's a massive scientific error, and he thinks that moving forward, philosophy and science need to kind of be buddies, I guess. That they really need to rely on each other. And look, I mean, I'm not a very scientifically minded person. Um, Maybe one of the things I appreciate about philosophy is that it can be very speculative. Um, but at the same time, I do agree with the sort of analytic idea that we need to be able to integrate science into our sort of into our metaphysics, and you know, the part of the project of analytic philosophy was really saying, like, look, as philosophers, we're not doing a good enough job of being aware of science. So, but when it comes to consciousness, a lot of materialists will answer, will say basically this is a scientific question. This isn't a philosophical question. This is something that if science hasn't explained it already, it's going to be able to explain it in the future. Like that is the general trajectory of science. We always think that there's a sort of a horizon that can never be bridged, and like, look, the whole history of science is constantly bridging that horizon. Um, why do you think that's not true, or at least incomplete?
Yeah, the answer to this conundrum is found in psychology, I think, because pretty early on in psychology, which is like a soft science, and it tries to have this scientific way about finding actual provable ideas or like hypotheses about consciousness, but it is a soft science simply because of the fact that consciousness itself is a black box phenomenon. You can see its behavior, you can see how a person behaves, but you can't look into them and see what they experience at this moment. And this problem is at the core of psychology, and they found like essentially the tools to work around it through the statistical analysis from on the scientific side, but also on the philosophical side by simply describing, using analogies, metaphors, and getting close to reality through a language that allows for flexibility. That's essentially the core of it. We have to see consciousness as this black box phenomenon, meaning we can't directly observe it, but we know that it interacts with reality, and we can observe those interactions, and those inform ourselves because, of course, we personally experience consciousness, and then using our own experience and correlating it with the experience of others can give us insights that are meaningful. And yeah, that's the gist of it. Like, yes, you can't observe consciousness directly, so it's hard to um, use scientific measures alone. This is where neurology leads us to, where we find neurological correlates. Materialists essentially die on the hill when they try to keep consciousness a scientific enterprise alone, because then you get to the hard problem of consciousness first of all. So if someone doesn't know what this means, it's simply saying is how to explain it easily. The hard problem of consciousness is like, is there something that is it's like for the color red, right? Is the color red something you can describe quantitatively, or is the experience of red something that exists independently of its description? Do you have a better explanation? Because it's like you can look at it from different angles, and sometimes I lose the tree for the forest, or what's the
Oh, the forest for the trees. Yeah, no, it's good. I think the way I've always thought about the hard problem is basically like, how do we account for qualitative experience if everything is basically reducible to material
Mhm.
and chemical reactions in the brain? I heard, again referencing Philip Goff because he's kind of my philosophical hero. Although he's gone in weird directions recently, but that's beside the point. But the way he describes it is, that color red, that not just the color red, but the experience of seeing the color red. If I cut open your brain, that it's not there. There's no experience of. There's no redness that exists within the brain. Um, and so, yeah, famously, this is I believe it was David Chalmers who first kind of articulated this problem, and this has led, I guess, to philosophy of mind exploding, and things like panpsychism becoming a lot more popular. But you were talking about something, and it reminded me of something Annika Harris said on Alex O'Connor's podcast recently, because she was talking about this intuition that we have, that you said that basically consciousness isn't publicly observable. There's no way of actually really empirically inferring consciousness in other beings or other entities. And I guess why not? Like, why is that intuition so flawed? Like, surely, you know, I live quite far away from my family, and when I go and see them, like, they're happy to see me. They give me a hug and everything like that. And why is it a non sequitur to infer conscious experience in other people when it so closely reflects my own experience?
Yeah, the best way to understand that is like looking at AI potentially, and then saying like the yeah, famous Turing test, for example. You can simulate behavior that appears to be conscious without it deriving from the same biological structures that give rise to the kind of consciousness we have. So humans are conscious beings because of their evolutionary history of developing a very complex brain that allows for hormonal structures, of cognitive structures in the brain, neurological, and so on. And I'm a panpsychist, so I don't say that AI can't have a consciousness. I don't say anything of that kind. But consciousness and the way we experience it is heavily correlated to our own structures. So you can have, like, for example, in acting, that this is another quite good example, can have an actor express an emotion without experiencing it the same way that this actor would experience it if he would have this emotion like in reality, right? So you can cry even though you aren't really sad. You can laugh even though you aren't really happy. And this means, in other words, that when you see someone behave a certain way, you can't be sure about what is going on the inside, because the same behavior can have different experiences on the inside. And yeah, this means that it isn't observable just by the behavior of the person. You can see your parents being happy about you, and you can infer it because you know them better than anyone else. But this inferring is more or less like an educated guess on your side. You can't be sure because you
Yeah.
don't live in their brain.
Yeah, I mean, next time I see my family, I'll just accuse them of being liars, so they're not actually happy to see me. No, but this is super interesting, and Annika Harris gave the way she broke this intuition down is she was like, well, we know that there are conscious, or at least we think there are conscious experiences happening where behavior is not reflected. So she talks about I believe it's called locked in syndrome, where someone's body is basically completely paralyzed and yet they're having a fully conscious
Mm.
experience essentially, and this can happen the result of various diseases. But doesn't this leave us with like a massive problem? Like from the outset, when we're thinking about the philosophy of mind and coming up with different models, it's easy to kind of like just jump this like just jump over the intuition that we're speaking about, just being like we just have to grant it to then like move forward. um so like how how do we, I guess, how do we like not fall into complete solipsism essentially?
Mhm. There are some ways. So let's start with an example in the sciences. So in neurology, you can, for example, make someone imagine a giraffe, ideally an artist, right? And he imagines a giraffe and even draws it for you. So you have an image of the giraffe they have in their head. And now you have a link to a certain neurological state and an image that is correlated to the state because you have the image and the conscious experience of the giraffe simultaneously. And this is like a Rosetta Stone, so to speak, to translate um, a brain state to a conscious experience. And this allows us to start creating a language of consciousness. And this language is like an approximation of what is going on there, because if you have an image of the giraffe, now they can think of a cat. And if you have like a long register of different images that are in the mind and also on the paper, you can start training an AI or like a computer to read them. And this is where science is currently working on in neurology. And there are already machines that can interpret dreams. So you can dream something, and the computer produces a movie that is kind of decoding your dream into a viewable file. This is one approach to it, and it is a very, very cumbersome approach because consciousness is so complex. You can have so many different experiences, and the visual experience of certain images is just a tiny part of it, right? It isn't including emotions, it isn't including thoughts, and there's so much more to it. So I'm not sure if this approach will ever lead to something that is completely depicting consciousness in a way that we think of it. And the other approach is in a way to kind of understand the origins of it all. Like, what is the purpose of consciousness? If you have, like, take evolution, right? As a general process. Once you understand that evolution's purpose is to, through random mutations or whatever you want to say, make animals more adaptable to their environment, you can understand the mechanisms behind it, even though we don't have access to dinosaurs living currently. We can we can find two different fossils and kind of create a story in our head that explains how we got from one fossil to the other through our understanding of how evolution works and why it does what it does. And we can do the same with consciousness. We can think about what is the purpose of consciousness, what does it even do, and if we know what it does, we can like try to essentially find a common like consciousness obviously is complicated and it's easy to fall into traps if you do so, but if you are rigorous with it, and this is like again the whole enterprise of philosophy is trying to do exactly that, we come to a point where we say, okay, experience allows us to interact with this world. So it has to essentially be an accurate image of this world. And we have to have similar experiences to communicate with each other and so on and so forth. So we see that experience itself becomes like this translation between the physical and the spiritual, between mind and body. And once you think of consciousness as this kind of translation, this kind of language of reality, you can work with it and try to see that two different people, even though you can't know what they think, can be interact with the world in a similar way, so they experience it a similar way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And going back to what you said about evolution, because I think evolution is, when we're reflecting on consciousness, is really interesting. And this does relate to the hard problem because it seems kind of inexplicable why evolution would produce qualitative experience at all, because it seems that natural selection, survival instincts are solely based on behavior. And there's this whole problem in philosophy where we talk about the philosophical zombie. Like, why could there not be a biological agent who has all of the same behaviors as a human, but nonetheless has no conscious experience whatsoever? So, I guess, why do you think that evolution? I mean, maybe this does start trailing into panpsychism and all that kind of stuff, but why do you think it's, I guess, evolutionarily beneficial to have conscious experience, if there is a reason?
Yes, this absolutely leads exactly to panpsychism if you think about it, because there are two ways you can go forward from this philosophical zombie idea, and one of the ways is like if you are diehard on the idea of materialism, you can go to the end of this route and say, well, maybe consciousness itself is just an illusion. It isn't really a thing, but more like a epiphenomenological byproduct. So it's like it doesn't have causal impact on reality. It isn't even really real. It's just that our brains give us the illusion of thinking consciously.
Yeah,
And
what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that view?
it is how to say it? It is a coherent understanding of reality. I wouldn't say it's wrong, but it doesn't feel satisfying to me in the sense that it is like it's like lying to yourself. You can have you do know that you have an experience, but because you accept axiomatically that materialism is true, you deny the experience. But the experience itself can be either real or so. Well, there, man. So of course, yeah, you can say it is it is wrong in the sense that an illusion is already in like per definition accepting consciousness and saying that it is deceiving your senses. So it is deceiving your conscious experience into believing something that isn't. So the conscious experience itself can't be an illusion because illusion is referring to an experience. But this is like in my understanding, it's just semantics because what they mean when they say illusion is like a meta illusion, an illusion one step deeper.
Sure, yeah.
And if you accept that meta illusions are a thing and you say conscious experiences are just electrochemical stimulation of neurons in our brain, and it isn't really like an actual real thing, but just a process that is looking for us like it's an experience, you can say, okay, this is a description of reality that works. But it, like I said, it feels like you just created this narrative to avoid accepting consciousness as real. It doesn't feel like it is acknowledging consciousness in the way that I want to acknowledge it as something more than the mechanistic reality.
Yeah, I think it. My big issue with like illusionism, which is kind of the byproduct or like what materialism entails, is kind of like, what's like if someone punches me in the face and I feel pain, you're saying that that experience is essentially not real. There's no way for you to account for that experience within your metaphysics. So you're just going to say, well, it didn't happen. I guess like I don't know how to make sense of that whatsoever.
Hmm? Yeah, it's only there to say essentially, hey, it's consistent. We are created
Sure.
through unconscious matter, and this complex creation is still unconscious. It just gives the illusion, gives rise to an illusion of experience. Um, but then again, even so, even if you accept illusionism, whatever the illusion is becomes then what a panpsychist means by consciousness. So either you call
Right.
it an illusion or not, it's almost irrelevant how you call it, because the illusion itself is still something you have to account for.
Yeah, I think yeah, that's great because you know when we typically think of something being illusion, it's kind of like, well, like our experience has been tricked. It's like we're inferring something that actually hasn't happened. Like we're bridging a gap that, um, or like seeing something that doesn't isn't reflected in ontological reality, but it kind of already presupposes that we have these
Mhm.
subjective experiences anyway. Um, so that's really interesting. But do you have anything else to say on materialism before I sort of move on to dualism, or?
Well, the final part would be to say, if we look at evolution, and this evolutionary process is complexifying the systems that are like essentially specific arrangements of matter. We start with individual atoms. Those become molecules through chemical interactions. We essentially trade evolution from this biological process to a more broad understanding of it that is called assembly theory. And assembly theory is essentially claiming as long as there are different kinds of particles around and they can interact with each other, over time things become more complex. And those how they become more complex in the biological sense is evolution, but you also have like electrochemical processes that are like trying to conserve energy. Whenever there are different kind of molecules around, they connect based on the octet rule and all the kind of stuff we learned in school and forgot again because it's not important to us. There's so much science behind that is simply saying, hey, matter behaves in a way that it tries to find an equilibrium in its environment. So the things that float around interact with each other to balance to find an energy equilibrium, a balance point where everything is perfectly stable. But the stability is like dynamic because there are of course environmental factors, and this dynamic stability over time leads to more and more complex interactions between the particles until we have things like multicellular life, humans, plants, and so on. This is the mechanistic understanding of it. The conscious side feels like it doesn't have a purpose at all if you think about it materialistically.
Mm.
But then again, if we just think about why do humans have senses, why do animals have senses, then we can easily give an answer. We can say they are to inform us about our environment and do the best to make the best decision at at the current moment of time. And making decisions, this intelligence that is essentially guiding our behavior, is a premise that once you understand that this is what guides our behavior in reality, even though we experience it consciously, you can kind of equate the two. You can start to understand information experience as being both something that is mechanistically understood as like input output. You get information, you uh, put them into the machine and get out behavior, but to essentially translate the information into behavior, you have to consciously experience it. So consciousness is what allows us to derive meaning out of information. And this is like also the intuitive understanding of consciousness we have. It
Mm.
feels meaningful to experience reality because we derive meaning out of the information we get. We see the world, we get visual inputs, we hear the world, we feel touch, and so on. We have all those senses, and those senses are like bits of information, first and foremost. They are just sensory inputs. But consciousness is what makes bits of information to something meaningful we can interpret. And this is the meaning of consciousness. We create meaning out of information. And if you see consciousness in this way, then you understand that this has to somewhat be fundamental, because where does meaning start to arrive, right? Like, is a human conscious? We all agree on yes. Is a frog conscious? Even nowadays, there are still a lot of scientists that wouldn't say so. But the frog still has to make decisions in its environment. It still has to take information in and put behavior out. And earlier on, we said, well, that's just instincts, right? But we know from, for example, reflexes. We can't really consciously choose how to react to an to a reflex,
Mm.
but we can consciously experience it. We know how it feels to hurt our toe and pull it away, or put our hand on a stove and suddenly jerk it away because we have this reflex inside us to not hurt ourselves. But we have an experience of what it feels like to have this reflex. It is still a conscious experience to behave this way.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're rapidly approaching panpsychism here, but before we sort of dive right in, I want to briefly address dualism because
Mhm.
I think probably this is the most common view of, well, maybe that's inaccurate to say now, but maybe historically, dualism has been a very common view, especially within the Christian philosophical tradition. Um, so, what is wrong with saying that the mind is a completely separate and distinct and like ontologically distinct thing from the material?
We would have to explain the causal relationship between the two realms. And if the moment we introduce a causal mechanism, there ceases to be a meaningful distinction between the realms. Because if they can interact, then they are essentially one big realm that has a bridge, right? Um, yeah, if you look at it, if there is no causal bridge, if you have like the soul and the body, but the soul doesn't do anything, then you simply inserted something unprovable, not causally interactive into your physical understanding of reality, and say it is there because I said so. So you can't prove it because it can't causally interact with your mechanistic reality that you actually inhabit. Yep.
Mm,
So yeah, dualism dies on the problem that we seem to live in this physical world. The physical world is the one we observe, and the spiritual world is like inserted essentially in a way, and if it doesn't interact, we can't test it. And if it interacts, it is essentially part of the physical, well, not part of the physical world, but it's part of the reality that we can interact with.
Mm. Yeah, I guess I think maybe a dualist would say, well, this is by far the most common sense view because we know that there are sort of tangible things out there that we call matter, but it seems like things like mental activity don't have any material reflection. Like a thought isn't like a tangible thing, and that experience of redness that we were talking about isn't tangible. It doesn't seem material. So surely there has to be an aspect of reality which is immaterial, essentially. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so historically, this made complete sense for me. So because before we had like brain scans and so on, there was no way to look inside our brain and see something move. So it was naturally like the status quo idea of reality. The moment we had neurological tools to look what is happening inside the brain, we kind of, well, actually way before we had brain scans, the moment we had people with severe brain injuries that changed their personality, we saw that the physical actually has impact on our conscious experience in a way that is like observable, because people can completely change their behavior after lobotomy or something, which kind of refutes the idea of the conscious soul that is governing the physical body independently of it. Because how could changing the brain change your soul, right? If it isn't connected in a way. Um, those are like the first kind of clues that show that the two things um, can't be separate from each other. This is simply because, like I said, if you're like essentially a soul in a mecha, right, that is
Mm,
controlling your physical body, then damage to the mecha shouldn't change your soul. It shouldn't change your spirit and your conscious experience.
mm,
You shouldn't be colorblind, for example, just because. Well, I think you can still argue for dualism in a way that would still be consistent if you say the soul isn't experiencing anything. Like the body is like an antenna that is collecting the data, but it becomes way more complicated than the classic Cartesian, no, not Cartesian, Kantian dualism that like was the historical view of the time.
mm. Yeah, I mean, I think dualism falls down as soon as you take into consideration the things you've just outlined. You know, like why is it that any material thing would is causally related to mental activity whatsoever? You know, if you take LSD, why does that have a an effect on your conscious experience? Like, I don't think dualism can account for that at all. And so I think that leads us nicely into panpsychism. So before we really sort of dive in to the intricacies of it, what is panpsychism?
Panpsychism is the essentially it breaks down to the idea that experience, consciousness is fundamental. You can have idealistic panpsychism that consciousness is the only thing that exists, or you can simply state that like physical reality and experiential reality are one and the same. And this is like the monistic, neutral monistic view of panpsychism that says everything that exists with the capacity to experience reality consciously.
Hmm. And I guess, I mean, this is a question that Joe Rogan asked Philip Goff like 50 times on the podcast. I don't think he was quite getting it, but um, like, why think that this is true? Is it just because the other theories suck, or do we have some sort of independent considerations that give us good reason to think that consciousness is fundamental?
So there is actually, in my opinion, the part of it, part of the of the appeal of from psychism is that it simply doesn't run into the same problems as other philosophical ideas. We now have like a track record of like 2,000 years of human thinking power, 2,000 years plus, actually way more than that, but like 2,000 years of well recorded and historically advancing human thought with writing and discussion, philosophy, and so on and so forth, that is looking at this, and every other approach failed. So this is telling us already that if panpsychism doesn't run into the same problems, like the um, the correlation between mind and body, um, the hard problem of consciousness, and so on, all those um, paradoxes, dilemmas, and so on dissolve once you take panpsychism seriously. This is already like first, like not proof, but at least it's indicative of what panpsychism is actually capable of. And then there is the point of uh, looking how reality works everywhere else. So no matter where you look at reality, things appear to be on a spectrum. We see it with pretty much everything. What's a good example to start off? Like the color spectrum, right? We know that things don't have like a single wavelength, but can vary and so on. But those are very um, those aren't maybe very good examples to visualize. Just look at psychology and phenomenology in human experience overall. We know that people are uh, like in IQ in all kinds of traits. Even gender nowadays is considered to be on a spectrum too, even though this is
Cool.
like still debated in America, for example, but you know what I
Hmm.
mean. And there are so many kinds of experiences that seem to be um, behaving on a bell curve, and
Hmm.
are there is like um, the most sorry, it's like now I lose some of my vocabulary to articulate what I mean. Um, okay, the easiest way to say it, if you just compare the complexity of conscious experience we experience with the one from a child that tries to explain its reality,
Hmm.
you already see that there is a qualitative difference. We have more nuanced vocabulary. We can differentiate between certain emotions better than a child that is simply saying, I'm sad or I'm happy. And we can say we are grieving, we are exhausted, like very nuanced experiences between anxious and excited and so on. So there seems to be this deeper conscious experience once the brain fully develops. And this is just within humanity. This is just within one lifetime of conscious experience. Then you have different species. You have like your dog that seems to definitely still be conscious, but on a different scale, essentially, because a dog won't do calculus. It won't experience. Um, it won't have philosophical debates with another dog about why why consciousness exists or so, something
I don't know, man. My dog's doing weird stuff. I don't.
like that. So yeah, this alone indicates some kind of process that allows for more than just an on-off switch, conscious and not conscious. And once you allow for any kind of spectrum to be real, and you see it in biology everywhere, things evolve on a spectrum, things become less and less complex, but still stay conscious to some degree. Then you get to this idea of where does it start to flip, right? Is there any cutoff point where you say, okay, this is the point where we say everything above that is conscious, everything below that isn't? And there is no good cutoff point because everything is like fluidly evolving, and you can't even make a clear cut definition of life itself. So how could you make one of consciousness? Um, we nowadays know that even cells can interact in a way that is agential. So they can make choices, behave intelligent to make progress towards their own goals and so on. And those are behaviors that we formerly understood as needing to have had conscious experience to explain. So yeah, it's simply a fact of seeing things on a spectrum and understanding that there is no objective cutoff point that everyone could agree on.
Yeah, I think that's great. But I guess someone would come back with is even if we see consciousness on this spectrum, and it's not binary, like it's not a one in zero, right? Um, why I think it's completely fundamental. Like you said, the cutoff points are completely arbitrary, right? But I think it's like super intuitive that like a rock doesn't have any experience. Like it doesn't seem we don't see our agential behaviors reflected in it, just
Mhm.
like on a very basic intuitive sense. So we might look at an animal and say, well, they seem to feel joy or they seem to feel pain. Like these are things that kind of reflect our own experience. But if we like look up and down on the ontological spectrum, like if we look at I don't know, yeah, like a rock, and then if we go up and we look at like a star, for example, like why think that there is no cutoff point at all and that consciousness basically exists in everything to one degree or another?
Well, the intuition is informed by the simple reality that a stone, even in a panpsychist framework, is fundamentally different in its conscious capacities to human. So if you find a panpsychist who says that even stones dream or something, then this is not a scientific understanding of panpsychism.
Hmm.
Panpsychism says, okay, the stone won't think about anything in a language sense. It won't try to calculate where it goes next tomorrow. It doesn't have a concept of future or past or so on. But just thinking about how the stone interacts with its environment reveals a little bit more rich of an experience than we would give it credit to. Simply by the fact that, um, like, let's say it's a small pebble, right? And there is strong wind, and it is in its environment. It has to move because the wind pushes it. This is like a physical interaction, and understanding it purely materialistically, you can explain why the stone moves the way it does. But you can do the same with humans. Nowadays, we know why the hand jerks away, why the muscles contract once we put our hand on a hot stove. It is like a physical process just as much as the stone moving is a physical process. So one essentially has to hold two things in mind at the same time. There is always a materialistic understanding of what things are, why things are happening. There is also the experiential component of it that we know exists at least within us. And if there is no cutoff point, then the physical explanation is always essentially always coincides with one experiential one. And the experiential one is like proportional in complexity um, to the physical one. So brain processes are incredibly complex. We have because we have billions of neurons in our brain, and all of them interact independently and create this very very complex reality and experiential dimension within us. And the stone doesn't have that, but a stone still has atoms that have to react to electromagnetic waves. They have to react to gravity. They have to react, like in a Newtonian physical sense, they have to uh, transfer their momentum if they collide with each other and so on. And all those interactions could happen in a multitude of ways, but are optimized towards energy efficiency, essentially. And this means that the stone has to make rudimentary decisions. Once it got hit by another stone, it has to essentially calculate its perfect trajectory, and it doesn't do that with mathematical understanding of it. It does it in the same way your hand jerks away um, once you've touched something hot, because it essentially creates a cascade of physical processes that lead the stone to move somewhere else. If you just drop the stone, it has to fall directly to the center of gravity of the planet Earth, because it experienced the gravitational pull pulling it down. It's a very simple process, and thus it's a very simple experience. It's just it doesn't see what's going on because it doesn't have visual optic nerves. It doesn't hear, think, or anything. It just behaves, falling down, experiences acceleration. And I can completely understand the idea of saying this is not qualitatively the same as our consciousness. I would say, sure, maybe we need a new word for complex consciousness, and say, hey, this whatever we have is like hierarchically, qualitatively, so much more complex that it deserves its own term. Like,
Yeah, because that's where I was going to go next. Because when you were saying that, I was thinking, I was like, okay, well, like what kind of things do we call consciousness? Like perception, attention, metacognition, and kind of these things that we know humans have, or like high level animals have. And it's kind of like, well, it looks like consciousness does exist on this spectrum, and there's differences of degree. But
mhm.
then would you also say that there are like differences of type? Because it seems like those three things I've listed, a rock doesn't have sense organs. So like how can it have perception? It doesn't seem to, like it doesn't have a brain. Like how does it integrate information? How does it attend to certain things and then not other things? It doesn't seem to think, it doesn't seem to have metacognition. So like when we say that there is, maybe this is super speculative, but like when we say that a rock has some sort of subjective experience, like what what might that be like?
Yeah. So we can look at every sense individually and break it down to physical forces. So we know that optic nerves are excited by photons, which is an energy transfer that is either through temperature increases or electromagnetic variations and so on. So there are physical processes behind it. And if you break them down, it helps to essentially think of everything in a way that is encoding information that is, well, based on physical forces. So the gravitational force seems to be something different than the electromagnetic one, and so on. And those maybe are um, different kinds of experiential data. So we obviously know from our own perspective that pain feels differently than the color orange. There seems to be two different types of qualia, and not all types of qualia are experienced by all types of systems. And then, but you also have the kind of combinatorial experiences. So you can combine two different experiences to an emotion. So euphoria is both a pleasure excitation and also maybe a concoction of different hormones and different kind of neurological things. There are so many different kind of physical forces that combine to create one emotion. So the emotion is a very complex qualia. It's a very complex experience that is combined through
Mm.
through a multitude of simple ones. And a stone, if it's so simple, won't have complex experiences, obviously. The only thing that is helpful here is like creating a new kind of science. And then Philip Goff also talks, for example, I think, about information integration theory,
Mm.
IIT, I believe. Um, it's a new kind of setup that simply tries to find a value to how complex consciousness is. And this value is defined with a new variable called phi. And the more information is integrated into a small area of conscious matter, in a way, the more complex the experience of this thing is. So a stone has a very low phi value, while a human has a very high phi value. Um, sometimes I hear the critique that if you do that and you realize, like, I randomly drop numbers here, but like, let's say a human has a phi value of 1000 and a stone has one of 0.001, then it almost feels like panpsychists are trolling at this point. Like, obviously, who cares about 0.0? You can't say it's not conscious if it's so low, right? But where it becomes interesting is to realize that, yeah, okay, so thinking of a stone as this minimally conscious thing makes it irrelevant for any kind of moral evaluation, consideration, and so on. And I agree with that. We shouldn't have human rights applied to stones. We shouldn't have
Yeah, of course, yeah.
um, all those kinds of considerations. So this is not where panpsychism becomes relevant or applicable. But we have to kind of broaden our horizon and understand that if this value of phi is explaining the complexity of conscious experience in a way that is representative of what this system, even if it's a simple stone or a human or whatever, um, what this system is capable of experiencing, then we can broaden our horizon and look at different kinds of systems. And we see, okay, a stone isn't that conscious on this spectrum, but we can look at an entire um, ecosystem or the like environmental system. We can look at a complex machine and start to calculate its phi value. How much information does it integrate? And our not panpsychist understanding of it wouldn't be able to account for conscious experience within those systems. But if you look at it purely through the understanding of how much information is integrated in the system, suddenly things like the economy can have a conscious experience because the economy is integrating a lot of information into it.
Hmm.
Markets are always calculating the most optimal prices. Um, like the thermo, thermo, what's it called? Well, the water cycles of temperature and here saline content, salt content in the oceans that create those things that go through the entire oceans and transport hot water from the Gulf of Mexico to Europe and so on. All
Yeah.
those are systems that are incredibly complicated because they take a lot of input variables and have to optimally create behavior that is representative of their of action. So they behave in a way that needs to integrate information. And panpsychist, if you understand it through a panpsychist lens, you have to understand that it is consciously experiencing those informations. And suddenly you get to a point where you think, wait a minute, doesn't that mean that the entire Earth, as an incredibly complex ecosystem of information, integration, and so much interaction within it, is in itself a conscious being, a being of with a conscious experience to it? And a panpsychist would say yes. And the phi value of the Earth as a system altogether might even be higher than the one of a human. And suddenly you have a thing that materialists would never consider as conscious, that a panpsychist with consistent argumentation, with a consistent logic to it, can attribute conscious experience to.
Yeah, I think that's great. I always go back to Thomas Nagel's very famous paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat, where he explains that, when we try and reflect on what it might be like to basically be a bat consciousness, like we always tend to like put human consciousness inside a bat body, but
Mhm.
actually we have no way of knowing what it's like to experience echolocation. And so at least Thomas Nagel seems to think, and I'm inclined to think, that there are basically different types of consciousness as well as different degrees, even though we can call it all consciousness. And by that, I just mean like a first person subjective experience. There is something like to be that thing, that there are like essentially different types. But I guess this leads us into a few quite famous problems that have been leveled against panpsychism. And the first one is the combination problem. So if we're saying that whatever fundamental matter is, whether that's a quantum field or like fundamental particles or whatever, if those have rudimentary experiences, how do we account for the fact that those things combine to create more complex experiences? Because it seems like if we think that any conscious um, system can sort of produce levels of consciousness, and that like particular instantiations of consciousness can then work as a system to produce consciousness. Like, do cities have a consciousness because like it's made up of like lots of humans? This kind of sounds like kind of like guardian angels and stuff like that. Like how do we account for the fact that more rudimentary things combine to form more complex versions of consciousness?
Yes. So if we are consistent with it, it leads to something like a city having a conscious experience. Absolutely. And I think useful analogies here to look at combinatorial things overall are found everywhere. So just look at an LCD screen. It exists. It is comprised of individual pixels. And if you zoom in, you see a red, green, and blue pixel, and they are all individual light signals. But if you zoom out, you suddenly get an image. And uh, even taking Nagel's "What's It Like to Be a Bad Thing," this LCD screen is capable of producing text that you can read. It is capable of producing images, movies. It is capable of producing all kinds of different images. So um, even though it is essentially comprised of fundamental pixels of light, and if you take the analogy to consciousness, you can have like fundamental bits of information that are consciously perceived. They can create and combine to completely different experiential conscious images. So image not in the visual, but in the completely experiential sense.
Sure.
Um, this kind of gives us a first um, rudimentary understanding of how things can combine. But we, of course, we can just look at the material world altogether and see that it's almost unfair to say that combination is a problem for panpsychism at all, because in the material world, things combine in so many different ways. So no one would claim just because there are fundamental elements or fundamental particles can get to elements, and you have the periodic table of elements, and no one would say, well, if there is gold and silver and so on, how can there be alloys of metals? How can there be suddenly desoxyribonucleic acid or something that here DNA? Of course, atoms can combine to molecules, and molecules can combine to all kinds of materials, and suddenly we have like objects. And this kind of physical combination is just mimicked on the experiential side, and we can't observe the experiential side, so it's harder to visualize. But it's the same kind of process. It's like with rising complexity, with rising material combinations, we have rising conscious representations of them.
Yeah, that's great. When you were talking, this reminded me of something. I think John Vervaeke said it, but I don't want to attribute to him something that he didn't say. But he, I don't know if this was a direct critique on panpsychism, but he basically says that um, brains are unique in the sense that they can um, create complex systems out of more rudimentary parts because of the speed of integration, essentially, like information integration. Um, but something like a city, to take the example we just used, like how is it that that can produce a conscious experience when it doesn't seem to have the ability to integrate information and create unified experience?
Um, yeah, great point, because I forgot this point, but it's important to also analyze. And I think here we have to look at the fact that time itself is kind of relative. So um, we in our body have fast systems like electric signals from one neuron to another that are moving almost at the speed of light, almost like electric signaling. But we also have hormonal systems that where until we have to produce the hormone, and it has to go through our bloodstream, and it can take like minutes to days until it finds the receptors and activates the experiential pathways there. So we in our own body have experiences of different speed. Some are background experiences, some are instances of thought where we have really, really fast integration of information. And they feel qualitatively, or definitely even qualitatively different, because there are different kinds of integration speeds. And if we go even more back and look at a group of people having a conversation, the conversation moves at the speed of sound, because the one person talks to another, the other one has to process the information goes back and forth, and it almost even goes at the speed of language, because language takes a certain time to express different ideas, and talking in a specific language makes information have a certain speed at which it travels from one person to another, and the conversation itself flows at a certain speed and creates a certain dynamic between all the participants in the conversation that is consciously expressed in the room. So we have consciousness at different speed scales, and a city would have a fundamentally different kind of speed scale than a human. It would essentially experience time or think in decades or so on. And this is, we see it in sociology, right? Because culture is moving at a different speed than technology. Um, Education from an individual person can move pretty quickly, but education of a certain entire nation, until everyone in the nation is literate or whatever, takes years and years and years. And all those processes become slower the bigger the system itself is, and the slower the information processes are. But we also experience acceleration there, because since the invention of the internet and the vast spread of using the internet as information channel, we actually feel like time is speeding up in a way. And I think this is representative of the acceleration of interconnectedness between people that is creating a new kind of conscious, also meta consciousness. This macro system now works on a faster scale and faster speed than before. It's just looking at how fast does information travel and extrapolating. The same kind of the same kind of level of consciousness in a human can take like 10 seconds, and a city would take 10 months, and in the same time frame they would have one thought, for example. And this is just an analogy, but to make it clear.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I always like to, if people doubt this, I always like to think about like group behavior. Like if you go to like a football game or whatever, like there seems to be something going on that completely transcends each person's individual experience. Or even if we look at something like when like riots happen, for example, there seems to be something that like there's this like group like spirit that like travels through people that seems to transcend the individual experience, and it almost seems to have agency. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it yeah, that's just super interesting to think about. The other problem that I think panpsychism might run into is um I don't know if there's a formal name for this because I haven't really heard many other people speaking about this, but it's what I've historically called the separation problem. But it might be better to call it an individuation problem. And that is like, how do we distinguish between different centers of consciousness? And by that, like, I mean, like, if you have like a rock, like falling down the side of a mountain, like, to what, like, when and to what extent is that rock part of the conscious system of the mountain? Like, is every time it touches, it's part of it, and then it like separates from it, and then it's a separate thing? But then, even if we think about like, even if the rock is static, like conceptually, we can draw lines around the mountain that includes the rock, but then we can draw lines around the rock that exclude the mountain. And even if we look at like the human body, like if we're saying that like the human mind is this conscious entity, but then like the human body is, and then like different parts of the human body are as well. Like it seems like we can make an infinite amount of conceptual distinctions between material objects. And so like, do we just fall into like a radical like mereological nihilism or like monism, or is there a way to really separate different conscious experiences from each other, or are these just essentially, is this just nominalism? Are these just conceptual distinctions?
Yeah, I think the most intellectually honest interpretation is, well, the most honest would be we don't know completely, right? But the most likely one to actually be true is that all reference frames exist simultaneously and are equally real. So there is the complete conscious experience of the stone and the mountain that is interpreting it both altogether, and there is the experience of the stone itself and the mountain itself. And this explains, for example, how if we are in a stadium and look at a sports game, we experience our own experience, but we also feel like there is a vibe in the stadium, and that this vibe has its own dynamics and own experience to it. So both existing simultaneously is very, very hard to grasp for us, because it always feels like we don't feel how our liver feels right now. We don't know what it consciously experiences at the moment. We always only feel like this one reference frame in a way, until there are like drastic measures like split brain patients that suddenly also only feel one center of consciousness, but demonstrably show that there are two, that there is this non-language brain part that is now separated from your center of language. So split brain, to just make it clear for everyone. There are people that, for example, to treat epilepsy, split their corpus callosum. So their two brain parts are now separated and can't communicate with each other. And those patients that have this drastic measure done to them, this brain operation, um, experience essentially behavior in their own body that doesn't seem to stem from themselves. So if they choose an outfit for the day, they grab with one hand to grab their shirt they want to wear this day, but the other hand that is controlled by the other brain part is wants to pull on something completely different, and takes a different shirt from the drawer, and is like, no, I want to wear this. It both experiences are happening at the same time, and are surprised about each other essentially. So you suddenly experience two consciousness within one person, and yeah, those kinds of experiences show that separation has to do with communication. So we kind of, if we want to look at what is creating separation, it's exactly this kind of integration speed. So at different speeds of information integration, we have different experiences. And like, let's say, on the speed that is electrochemical signaling of our neurons, all the information that are happening there are integrated into one experience, and we think this experience is us. And of course, whatever is happening at the moon at the moment, or in the brain of your neighbor, isn't communicated at the same speed into your brain. So it feels like it's separated from the speed. Um, yeah, so this is kind of the solution to that question. We just have to look at different channels of conscious experiential speed, so to speak. And within every one of them, there is separation simply based on how much information can travel to one point at this speed.
Yeah, that's great, and I think you also kind of alluded to this, but I guess um, one of the things that sort of the combination problem might run into is that, like, as we've been discussing, right, like consciousness is not publicly accessible. Like, I have no way to like hop into your brain and experience whatever you're experiencing. So it seems like prima facie, like minds are entirely distinct. So is it just through language that you see this information integration, or there are other, or are there like other underlying mechanisms that allow for um, to integrate on larger scales between distinct minds?
So there are different kind of information channels that transcend the mind in a way, and but those are experienced on a different scale. So of course there's gravitational pull at a very large scale. A solar system um, doesn't speak human languages, it doesn't operate like a mind, but it still transfers information from one planet to another through gravitational pull, and the entire system behaves accordingly to that information. But this is like very much transcends our human understanding of consciousness. So to get to a more approachable example, like can you summarize the question again?
So if we think about minds being basically distinct and
Mhm.
consciousness not being publicly available, how is it that information can integrate between distinct minds to
Okay.
then combine into larger complex systems? Because it kind of doesn't seem like so like crazy to think about like fundamental particles being able to do that, but
Yeah.
when we think about like human minds combining into
Okay.
more complex
I
system,
get it.
it seems like they don't have this way to like connect with each other. Does that make sense?
Yes. I believe maybe that's actually like a limitation of our language currently. We think of minds as being those isolated islands in a way, but what is, in my opinion, more likely to happen underneath is like if you look at all particles individually being fundamental, you can have this chorus, this like every a single experience is like a tone in this orchestra of conscious music. So every single conscious experience is happening next to each other, and the result of that is like this melody of experience, and this it can have if it's correlative enough, simply like if you play a chord on a music instrument, you can play multiple tones at one, and they sound like they are harmonic to each other. They sound like one experience, and this is kind of like the mind works. It's highly correlated. So all the tones, all the individual experiences in the mind happen extremely synchronized to the point that they are experienced at one as one. And two different minds, are not as synchronized because they don't happen in so close proximity. They don't happen in so much coordinate in such a coordinated fashion. So they are out of tune in a way. And by them being out of tune, they are separated in that sense. If you have two people being really in tune, This is, for example, a really long married couple that is like was married their entire life, and then they start to complete each other's sentences and
Yeah.
know when the other one is thirsty and so on. They become more and more synchronized with each other, and thus their conscious experience, those two minds suddenly act more as one. And it is solely a result of how synchronized two material systems interact with each other. The higher the synchronization degree, the more it is experienced as one. But this degree of being one experience is always, it's always an illusion in a way. And then I hate to use the illusion because of the way we criticized this before, because it obviously isn't an actual illusion. It is like, but it is playing a trick on us. It is, everything happens next to each other, but feels like it is happening in one place. But we know, for example, we know that when we stub our toe, it doesn't hurt in our conscious experience in the brain. It hurts where our toe is.
Mm.
So the experience is somewhere else than our mind is in this moment. We have this field of experiences everywhere in reality, but the more synchronized the experiences are, the more they feel like they are coming from the same place.
Yeah, that's great. What this kind of brings up for me is like, what does this say about the self? Because if it is the fact that to some extent the self is illusory, um, and that we aren't so separate from other minds and other
Yeah.
things, like maybe this is like a soft non-dualism kind of vibe.
Mhm.
Um, like, does that mean that there is essentially no such thing as the self? And like, if that is the case, how do we account for that illusion? Because to me, it's kind of like I always hear people saying like the self is an illusion, like memory creates this illusion and all this kind of stuff, and it's like, well,
Mhm.
that's all great, but like, why does the illusion occur? Like, why do we experience ourselves as being distinct subjects if actually the barriers between us and other conscious beings aren't as hard as we like to think sometimes.
Yeah, great question. The point here is, maybe instead of saying the self is an illusion, we have to distinguish between objects and processes. And the self isn't an object, it's a process. And once we do this distinction, we can, for example, use an analogy like a whirlpool in an ocean, right? The self is this whirlpool, but it isn't a separate thing from the ocean. From the ocean, it is something that is happening in this body of water, and this process is stable. It is meta stable, repeating itself in a way that makes it essentially behave object like. It is moving through the body of water, it is um, acting on the body of water. We as a body are a collection of processes that happen in a stable way, in dynamic stability, so things can change, and we can be hungry, we can be happy, sad, and so on, and things can change in our self experience, but um, they aren't distinct. So all the individual atoms and molecules within us can change over time, um, and in a way, not just can change, but we can't even stop them from changing. We are constantly connected and exchanging with our environment through our breath, through food and water intake, through pooping everything out again. Um, all those processes are like us exchanging material with the world around us. And what we experience as the self is simply the process the, of the environment stabilizing the form that is occupying you and your brain, or the individual person. And once you think about it as a process, I think the question becomes self-explanatory in a way, because we always we can absolutely think of us as of a whirlpool, for example. You can look at, if you open the water in the bathtub and the water drains out, you see the whirlpool created, and I think like, oh yeah, okay, this I can see the whirlpool. The whirlpool is actually real. It exists. It isn't an illusion, but it isn't separate from the bath water itself.
So, if the self is um, basically a process or like a series of processes and not like a distinct static object, like a soul or whatever else, what does this say about free will? Because I can I can see why people are listening to that and basically saying, well, this is complete. This is determinism essentially. Like we have no real control over our actions. It just seems like our actions kind of collapse into being part of the process.
Yeah. Well, determinism and free will is something it's something I changed my mind a lot about, not because I'm indecisive or anything, but because it seems so contradictory. Um, Science, the materialistic understanding of reality, seems to obviously point towards determinism. The only thing that
Yeah.
is not determined or isn't sure to be determined is the better way of putting it, seems to be quantum mechanics. And
Hmm.
A, we don't really understand quantum mechanics yet. So science isn't complete in this regard. And B, the best thing we can dream of um, seeing quantum mechanics as is not libertarian free will, but randomness. And
Yeah.
randomness is just as arbitrary. So
Yeah.
we don't have a physical mechanism for libertarian free will in this kind of sense, which means at least to some degree we have to get more comfortable with the idea that everything is determined. And even in neurology, even if it's related to consciousness, we see this all the time. um, Kids can't decide whether they have ADHD or autism, but they are incredibly influence their behavior. And it's like you can't consciously choose to not have a specific condition. You can't choose the brain you occupy. And obviously those are incredibly determining in the kind of behavior that you will display, the kinds of choices you will do. And so nowadays, most, like neurologically speaking, most neurosciences scientists say it is pretty much a closed case, scientifically speaking, that our behavior is determined by physical processes, which is
Yeah.
hard to accept. And like like I said previously, I kind of started from this atheistic, materialistic understanding and was like, just deal with it. That's the reality of it. But once you integrate panpsychism, there is like this. I'm sure you're familiar with compatibilism, and compatibilism is just
Yeah.
a reframing of what free will actually is. It is saying, well, free will doesn't have anything to do with libertarian free will, so it
Sure.
isn't free of the physical reality, but you're just free to do what the physical processes want to do in a way. So
Yeah.
it,
Yeah. I
it
mean, yeah. Yeah. Go on.
it's a cop out for me at least. It's a
Mm.
cop out because it changes the term and doesn't acknowledge that that's not what people want free will to be.
Yeah. No,
Um,
uh, I completely agree. I don't. I think compatibilism is a very clever semantic game, but
mhm.
um, it doesn't provide the thing, as you say, that people want out of free will. But how about this? Like, if we're saying that, like, if we're looking at panpsychism and we're saying like, well, like matter is like consciousness from like a third person perspective,
Mhm.
then can't we just say that like these material processes are will from a third person perspective? Because even if we can't say that, like we can't have libertarian free will, right? We can't have the, I always mess up the acronym. I want to say it's the potential of alternate possibilities, right? This PAP thing that is like
Mhm.
integral to libertarian free will, this ability to have been able to do otherwise, essentially. Like even if we can't have that, can't we sort of have a form of compatibilism in the sense that like it's not that there are like external things that are like forcing our hand necessarily, but it's that like our choices actually do happen within ourselves, the process that we call ourselves, and that is an expression of will, but from a third person perspective, that just looks like material mechanisms.
Yeah, this is exactly where I'm kind of landing on nowadays. Um, Again, look at the whirlpool, and it is completely physically determined why it moved that way because of the physical laws that govern it. But once you say, but the whirlpool is consciously choosing to move that way, and those choices represent the or are the result, no, those choices are the representation of the physical laws that created them. It's in a way saying that if you prefer, um, I don't know, like salad as rather than cornflakes as your breakfast, and you stand up, take the salad out and eat it in the morning, then it is a physical law. It is causally determined that you will eat that. Not and you didn't choose that because it was determined, but because you prefer salad, it became physical law in a way. So your choices are ontologically prior to causal determinism. Your will is what makes things determined in a way, which doesn't mean that you could have chosen otherwise. Well, that's where things get interesting, right? Because maybe you could have before the causal change started. That this is um, the only moment in time, in a way, that was causally free. But if we look at take the scientific understanding and say if we look at the Big Bang, the first moment of space and time where everything um, started to exist and started to happen causally, physically determined, and it started a chain reaction. At this moment, everything was non-determined because it wasn't it hasn't yet started. But
Mm.
if consciousness in this sense is like fundamental to everything, then this is where the first and final and only free choice happened. And then again, we have to have this non-dual understanding that in the Big Bang everything was at one place, and everything that was there made a decision for itself. But itself was everything there is at this moment.
Mm.
So you were part of this everything there is, and you chose your path with everything else that you went there, and it instantly becomes incredibly metaphysical. It becomes so much like so many spiritual teachings, and it is bound to almost be religious in a way to explain things like that. But just looking at the case that everything you want to do in life, your all your choices can be both determined and your real choices, becomes like a kind of real compatibilism, because suddenly you
Mm.
flip the script and say that your will, your intentions are what determines everything, and this creates the natural laws that we then describe as determining your intentions, but it's actually the other way around.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's great. And I'm glad what you said. You mentioned like kind of thinking about this kind of evokes religious sentiment and stuff like that because what I want you to ask you about next is pantheism essentially because I have been kind of led into pantheism through panpsychism in the sense that if consciousness is fundamental and that scales all the way down to fundamental matter, then that must also scale like all the way up to like
Mhm.
the sum total of all existent things must also be conscious in some way. Um, and I believe that not only does that evoke some sort of religious sentiment, um, but it seems to me that it does also meet sort of a minimum definition of God, of
Mhm.
theism. So are panpsychists committed to theism, pantheism?
Under the definition of, under the, like you said, I like the term minimum definition of God. I think so. Yes. Um, I'm pretty sure many theists wouldn't invite us to their party though, because they have more than the
True.
minimum definition of Godhood. And once you integrate some criterion under your definition of Godhood that are more like, yeah, Homo sapiens like person,
Mm,
you essentially discredit panpsychism as a theistic framework, because whatever the universe at large as an agential being that is like an all present, all encompassing God is,
mm,
it it will behave intelligently, it will behave agently, because everything it does within it is in itself an expression of its agency, right? But it will not have this kind of human consciousness that we historically thought of as being God. So it kind of breaks or comes down to your definition. But if you take the minimal one, then I think yes, then whatever the universe is an intelligent, all present being that is all powerful in the sense of being all powers within it.
mm. Well, I think the problem you've pointed out isn't, well, at least it's not a problem for me because I think the idea that like God is basically like an immaterial mind or is like a person in the same sense that humans are persons. Um, this is a view on theism that is often called theistic personalism, or at
Mhm.
least has been called that by critics of it. Um, and that is a very modern understanding of what God is. If we look at, classical theism, um, more in the vein of the classical Catholic and Orthodox traditions, that sort of culminate in someone like Aquinas, for example.
Mhm.
Um, Aquinas has like no patience for like theistic personalism. Essentially, he would cry if he read what Richard Swinburne has to say about what God is, um, because for them, like for Aquinas, like God is ipsum esse, like God is being itself. God isn't just like an immaterial mind, because and famously classical theism subscribes to divine simplicity and stuff like that, which is kind of a whole other conversation about whether that fits into the pantheist framework. But um, talking about sort of more religious things, because I like to look at religious ideas through a philosophical lens as well. What, if anything, does panpsychism tell us about the afterlife? Because I think people might worry. I mean, a materialist might be uh, more prone to accepting panpsychism as a sort of a non-reductive materialism, if that makes sense. But I guess like a religious person might look at panpsychism and say, well, if the self is a series of material processes, essentially, and that's what consciousness is like, and there is no eternal soul and that kind of stuff, like, essentially, there has to be no afterlife, um, and for that reason, they might be a bit hesitant about panpsychism, and this is where I think Philip Goff seems to have confused himself in terms of his theistic views and then his panpsychism. Like, do you think panpsychism tells us anything about the afterlife, either in the affirmative or the negative?
Yes, I think it does. Because, first and foremost, the self isn't a series of materialistic processes, but monistic ones. The experiences are
Mm.
integrated within it. So once the processes stop, right? Once the body disintegrates, all the parts of it become part of new processes. And this is like, in a way, you can argue that there is no afterlife in panpsychism because there is no after and before. Um,
Right,
Everything
okay.
is continuous. And once your current self disintegrates, everything that made up your current self, everything within those processes becomes automatically integrated in new parts of selfhood and new parts of systems. In some systems, it didn't even disintegrate, right? So your system, your human-based system, so to speak, can die, so the processes stop. It's like the whirlpool that suddenly um, the bath water drained completely. There is no whirlpool in your bathtub anymore. But the water didn't disappear. It now flows somewhere else, and this flow is still consciously experienced. So um, if your body decomposes and you bury yourself in the ground, you become part of the soil. You become part of whatever worms are eating you, and so on. And all the parts become part of new systems. So it is like, maybe if you think about it spiritually, it's like reincarnation, but
Mm,
not in one piece, not in this undividable soul kind of understanding that is
mm,
re-entering the game, but more like everything that was separate before now becomes unified, but also separate in its own kind of way in all the parts that it is now part of. It just starts new processes, and those processes will also be conscious, and they will also be what formerly was you is now something else. It is it is not the kind of heaven where you always stay Ben and I always stay Alex,
yeah.
but it is also not the kind of thing where everything stops existing and there is nothing there anymore. So it's not the end of everything.
Yeah, I mean, in a recent article, I compared it to basically the Buddhist doctrine of rebirth, which is a little bit more subtle than like strong versions of reincarnation, because obviously they have that anatman idea as well. Like they have this idea of no self. They would see um, the self as being a series of processes as well. I mean, maybe the distinction here is that they believe there's like a karmic continuity between
Mhm.
this life and the next, even if it's like the next life is it's not me, but it's also not me. But there is this like karmic continuity, and I guess that sort of leads me into my final question, just wrapping up here. It's interesting to think about panpsychism because I think for me it kind of touches on all areas of philosophy, and one of the areas in which people don't really speak about much is ethics. Um, I I I think panpsychism and this like non-dualist or monist conception of panpsychism um, definitely has ethical implications. So I didn't know if you had any thoughts on sort of the ethical implications of panpsychism, if you think there are any.
I think there is a case to be made for them, but I'm almost hesitant to say that, like, if we break down what ethical implications at all mean, then what we mean by them, especially in the hard objective sense, is that there are universal odds, right? Odd statements that people should follow or things should follow. And once we see will as determining the processes themselves, it kind of becomes evident to me that all odds are in themselves just an is, if you know what I mean.
Sure, yeah. It's kind
And
of collapsing the is or distinction that David
exactly.
Hume makes, yeah.
And this makes it really fun or funny to me to differentiate between what is ethics and what is just description of nature. Because yes,
Mm,
you can like draw a line between them and say, okay, we should we ought to be striving towards like an almost Christian ideal of like Jesus as a kind of ideal person in a way. And then I find that valuable in many senses because
Mm.
like love thy neighbor is essentially what comes out if you understand that you and your neighbor aren't separated actually.
Yeah.
So I see the moral vision there, but then again, you can't criticize someone for not following that if their behavior is the natural flow of things, if that's just the way things are. So
Yeah.
you know it becomes difficult to talk about odds that um, try to judge people. So you essentially lose the concept of judging someone for their behavior. You can try to define ideals, and it is helpful to talk with other people and try to decide for yourself what your ideals are and try to convince others of your ideals and so on. But the moment something happened, you don't have the right to say this person is bad because they just behaved in the same way determined by the whole union like you know what I mean? It's
Mm.
it's it's both morally objective and also completely arbitrary because it's just how it is.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's really interesting to think about because, in the some sense, like I completely agree with you. I think there are like two directions you could take this in. Like you could take it in the direction of like this concept of non-dualism and kind of like, well, if you and other people aren't so separate and consciousness exists in all things, then like we need to confer moral value to a particular extent, and that does sort of act as a objective ground of ethics in some sense. And I think that's historically what I've argued about being a ground for utilitarianism, even though I'm becoming slightly unsure about utilitarianism. I think it remains the fact that it removes a sort of this arbitrary nature as positing suffering as being sort of an intrinsic bad or an intrinsic evil. But I think on the other hand, and I think I commented on one of your recent articles about this. On the other hand, it kind of trivializes like all experiences essentially, and kind of collapses them all into one thing. Like if all experiences are just an expression of the universe, like particular qualia, like coming up in the universe and then like fading away or whatever, it becomes very hard to say that any of those experiences are actually good or bad. It seems like moral language is completely subjective, not only like personally subjective, but like subjective in terms of like humankind. It seems
Yeah.
like it is just this social construct that we have invented. So yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on how we might solve that problem, or if it's solvable, or if we kind of just have to swallow
I
it.
think what I advocate most for is a kind of um, non-judgmental moral optimism, and what I
Hmm.
mean by that is um, you can't really distinguish between good or bad in the present because all just is how it is in a way. But what you can always say is that things are tending towards more integration. Things become more and more connected over time. This is like the if you just look historically what happened, things became more connected. And through this more connection, whatever we previously had as a separate selfhood expanded. Our um, our circle of empathy is constantly growing, and it isn't growing at a pace that makes everyone happy because no one there will never be a time that where everyone is equally satisfied because everyone has a personal kind of circle of empathy, circle of selfhood, who to integrate and who to take into self and who to exclude and so on. And currently we still have things like racism where we exclude other human beings and so on. And let's not start with veganism and whatever. But what is like historically consistent is the fact that our circle of empathy, our circle of what to include, is constantly growing simply because we are more and more connected, more and more integrated. And systems try to balance out because it's in the interest of everyone. The very encouraging thing here is that you don't even just have to look at human history. If you look at our DNA, and I think Richard Dawkins wrote recently his last and newest book that talks about this, that DNA is mostly like a community of viruses. Formerly, most of our DNA was formerly a virus that was hostile to its host. But through evolution and so on, and like I said, evolution is the physical process, but the experiential one is through the striving to get better. Essentially, the experience behind evolution is this constant adaptation and actually conscious adaptation to one's environment, accepting how it is, improving your growing, improving, and all those experiential terms are essentially what the mechanistic process of evolution comes down to if you accept the monistic understanding of them. And yeah, we see us constantly improving, growing, and formerly antagonistic systems try to compromise. And we have this almost Hegelian pendulum process of thesis and antithesis getting closer together, finding a way that is beneficial for everyone, win-win situations. And even the most hostile virus over time realizes that killing all its hosts takes away their own ground of living. So they become less and less hostile until they realize if they become beneficial for the host, then they grow more hosts to be part of. And so even a virus can become something good for the person, like in this case. And when we look now at our DNA, we see that most of our genetic material is comprised of formerly hostile viruses that are now beneficial to us. And this is like a biological history that spans over millennia, right? And we human culture is just like this tiny slither, and I hope we don't self-destruct before we solve everything. But even if we would do, the overall system of this non-dual material complexification process is constantly self-improving to the point of more integration and more harmonious living together. So like I said, there is no ought, but the is process that is constantly going on is always striving for more harmonious living conditions for everyone included. So it's like a system that becomes more moral over time if we strive for this kind of moral ideal.
Yeah, I mean, wow, that's awesome, man. Thank you very much. I mean, I think we're gonna call it there before we tick into our third hour. Um, Thank you so much for coming on.
So pleasure.
Why don't you tell everyone where they can find you?
Yeah, like I'm found on Substack, Left Brain Mystic. Subscribe to me, subscribe to Ben. We are doing stuff in the name of philosophy, in the name of wisdom and knowledge, right? Um, I almost post daily, so be careful to not get overwhelmed. But there's stuff for everyone. So I hope if you found this discussion interesting, then you will definitely be interested in the kind of things I write. And
Yeah.
yeah, thanks, Ben, for the opportunity.
Well,
A lot of
thank you.
fun.
I mean, yeah, I'll link your Substack in the description so people can find it easily. But yeah, that was amazing, and in the description will also be links to my Substack, social media, and also if you are inclined to support me financially, there's also links to my Buy Me a Coffee where you can make a one-time or regular donation, and also browse the shop for a few cool items on there. But thank you very much, Alex.